For those of you new to my channel, this is going to be a very technical review of the 9mm f2.8 lens from Nisi, hopefully simplified right down to please both the pixel peepers and hobbyists alike. Now, as always, I do feel inclined to state that this lens was sent to me by Nisi, but also, as always, they have absolutely no say in what I get to say about this, nor do they get to even preview this video before publishing. This review is 100% my own findings, though I will keep most of my personal opinions out of this video and save them for the end. And for those of you wondering, I performed all of the following tests on the Fujifilm X-H2S, though all of this info will apply to whatever camera or mount you buy this lens for. To start things off with a few of the basics, this 364-gram lens is manual focus only. At a full frame equivalent of 13.5mm, which is 133-degree field of view, it's very wide. Its filter and lens cap size is 67mm. It is weather sealed, which I love, and it has a very nice yellow weather sealing ring right at the mount of the camera, and it's a metal construction. The aperture ring is declicked, which video users will love, as this results in a far smoother aperture adjustment when recording video. Travelling from f2.8 to f16, it is very smooth and has a perfectly firm resistance for when rotating it. Though it does only have marks for full f-stops and no t-stops, as you'll see later on in the video, stopping down just a smidge might be something you'll be wanting to do. For those of you aren't aware, focus breathing is like a little bit of a forced zooming in and out that happens when you adjust the focus of a lens. What we're looking for here is at the very edges of the shot for things to be moving in or out as I shift the focus. Some of you might not care about this, but when it comes to video or focus stacking photos, every little change is noticeable or harder to align in post. With the Nisi 9mm having a minimal focus distance of just 20cm, there is a huge range for it to cover, but very pleasingly, focus breathing is very minimal. Now, I know some people will really struggle with understanding MTF charts, so I've translated the 9mm MTF results into this style. The colours represent how sharp on your sensor your shot will be, with blue being outstanding and red being horrific. For those pixel peepers of you wondering about these results, they are based off 30 lines per millimeter. What this means is these results will change in colour depending on how fine of detail you try to resolve with them. And that 30 lines per millimeter testing is harsh testing. You can nearly think of this as how well does it work on a 30 megapixel sensor. And as you can see, this lens is fantastic with just a smidge of softness in the corners, especially for how wide it is, as the wider a lens is, the harder it is to make sharp. But what is odd, though not unheard of, is the lens is actually a little softer at f8. Which is actually very good news for those of you wondering about using this lens for astro or low light shooting, as it means the lens seems to be pretty optimized for wide open. Though, as I know many of my viewers are Fujifilm shooters, do note this lens was released not long after Fujifilm released its 40 megapixel sensor. And if we crank up the difficulty of this test to say 45 lines per millimeter to better represent the higher resolution of the 40 megapixel sensor, you can see this lens does drop down to pretty average results. But also, in Nisi's defense, there isn't a single lens that is this wide that I could find that does resolve well on a 40 megapixel sensor, aside from Fujifilm's own 8 to 16mm lens, which brings me around very nicely to the price. With the Nisi 9mm coming in at only $459 US, compared to Fujifilm's 8 to 16mm lens, which is over 4 times the price at $2,000 US. So it's not the very best super wide angle lens you can get, but for a fraction of the price for most users, this lens kicks ass. Flares are very obvious and incredibly easy to get at 9mm, especially if you don't use the included lens hood. At f2.8 you do get a lot of prismatic style flaring if you point your camera in the wrong direction, but these disappear very quickly by darkening up your aperture by about 2/3 of a stop, so just a smidge. As you can see in this footage here, those flares near the source disappear very quickly just by darkening up the aperture. In sunlight, I still did get a little blue ball in the opposite corner all the way to f16, but otherwise this lens is incredibly clean. And most of the flares are actually very pleasing, with the light source giving off those beautiful pointed flares at all apertures, not just when you're shooting at the darkest of apertures. For this little homemade distortion test, what we're looking for here is to make sure the vertical lines of the building stay straight with the vertical black bars I've overlaid on this video. Feel free to pause this clip anywhere to see how well things line up, though do note if we have a bigger gap at the top than at the bottom, that just means my camera wasn't perfectly level. What we're looking for here is a curve to the building and for the verticals to have a different spacing in the middle compared to the edges. And as you can see, the distortion control is fantastic and everything is perfectly straight. But do note at 9mm, no matter what lens you're using, if your shot isn't perfectly level, you're going to get a lot of perspective warping, which is not distortion, it's a different thing. However, when it comes to vignetting, this lens does have quite a bit. Trying to shoot this test at 9mm in the middle of the day was pretty tricky without getting the sun in the shot. But what we're looking for here is a darkening of the corners, which as you can see is pretty obvious wide open at f2.8 and reduces very noticeably each time you darken the aperture down a stop. I did wonder if the lens hood could have caused some of this, so I did the test a few times without the hood on, but as you can see the vignetting is still very obvious and without the hood we get tons of flaring. But for those of you who have watched my other lens review videos, you know I personally really don't care about vignetting, as I usually add some later on, and it's very easy to remove in post. At this wide you're pretty unlikely to be doing much panoramic work, however for you astro pano shooters this will be a bit of a pain to deal with, as having different exposed elements as you're trying to merge photos together is just an extra step of editing you're going to have to fiddle back and forth with. As this lens is very wide and bright, there will be a lot of you who will be considering this lens for astrophotography, and aberrations are also star colors, so we're going to go into a bit of detail with this section. For testing aberrations, I actually based this off an old astro test I worked out that measures the size of all aberrations in one hit, including chroma, coma, and spherical aberrations. For those of you who aren't aware what aberrations are, these are pretty much extra lens flaws that can appear from your lens, normally near the edges or high contrast details that reduce detail, but don't always show up in normal sharpness MTF testing. Now once again, this is a very over-the-top pixel peeping kind of stuff, taken from as far into the corner of the lens as possible, where things are normally the worst. And to really stress how over the top this is, we're looking at this little speck of light at over 600% zoom. So to start with, as far as all aberrations go, things look a little odd all the way up to f16 where spherical aberrations kick in, though there is a small smidge of coma at f2.8. This means if you're shooting anything that's not astro, just don't shoot at f16 and you'll be right. So to test this a little further, I actually had to wait a few weeks for a new moon to do a few real world astro tests. Now do note astro season is getting very close to finishing here in New Zealand at the time of recording, so capturing the galactic core wasn't an option, but all I really wanted to test was this lens's effect on stars. What I was looking for here was to see if real-world testing and exposure differences would change the shape of stars. Though, as another note, there was a small amount of cloud on this night, so we're not looking at image quality, just star quality. And if we pick a bright star and zoom in, you can see at all exposure levels it's giving off quite a pretty star flare style of shape, and even this darker stars look pretty nice. However, if we look around the edge of the frame, you can see that all stars are stretched a little towards the middle of the lens, and if we zoom out you can see that vignetting is pretty obvious. So on to my final thoughts. There are a few things I think this lens is fantastic for. Number one, video. With its pretty flares, fantastic manual focus, declicked aperture, minimal focus breathing, and very solid construction. If they just slapped the word cinema into the title and added T-stops and made it so you could connect a follow focus to, which by the way is very easy to do as it is, they could have doubled the price and people would have been over the moon. As a cheap intro lens for astrophotography, I think this lens is great, but as you've seen, it does have a lot of vignetting and a bit of chroma, so if you're new to astro, the wider and brighter you go, the easier it is to get great quality astro photos. Nisi have made a bit of a unique lens here, and if your work would suit something a bit unique at a cheap price, the Nisi 9mm f2.8 Super Sunstar wide-angle lens might just be for you. If you've enjoyed the informative nature of this review, please hit the subscribe button, or if you have any questions about this lens, please leave them down in the comments below. I'm pretty good at getting back to people. My name's Thomas, thank you for making it to the end, and until next time, I'll catch you next time.